the UP DNA Analysis Laboratory, although I'm actually from the UP Office of Legal Aid as a supervising attorney there. So after today's discussions this morning, we had a very interesting talk on both the Philippines status of the drug, the status of the Philippines with respect to the drug policy and the programs, as well as an international perspective given by our international guest, the UN rapporteur, who's quite controversial. But the messages that she gave this morning are really inspiring because she gave us a look at what the future could be, that there are better options to the current practice and policy in the war against drugs, if it can be called a war really. And again, our speaker on the Philippine status on the drug war also gave some data, encouraging data and encouraging plans, which if are actually implemented would really result in improvements to what is actually happening now. So hopefully in the future, with more forums like this, people will get more ideas, more opportunities, so that the drug problem can be solved in a way that protects the human rights of everyone. So now for this afternoon, we have two speakers lined up. Our first speaker, who would talk on a public health approach to the war on drugs, is from the University of Columbia. He is the chair of the Department of Psychology and Dirk Schiff Professor in the Departments of Psychology and Psychiatry at Columbia University. He earned a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science from the University of Maryland. He then earned a PhD in Neuroscience from the University of Wyoming. Dr. Hart is known for his research on drug abuse and drug addiction, which focuses on the behavioral and neuropharmacological effects of psychoactive drugs. He uses his research as a scientific basis for his worldwide presentations on the importance of decriminalizing drugs. He has lectured in Africa, Asia, Europe, North and South America, and has testified before the United States Congress and around the world as an expert witness on psychoactive drugs. He has published more than 100 scientific articles in the area of neuropsychopharmacology, and in 2013, he published the book High Price, A Neuroscientist's Journey, that challenges everything you know about drugs and society, which received the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award in 2014. I would like everyone to give a big round of applause to our first afternoon speaker, Professor Carl Hart from the Columbia University.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, right on. I'm happy to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. I have been coming to the Philippines since 1984, 1985. I was in the U.S. military. I was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and so we're not too far from here. And I have been coming back periodically since. And I love the Filipino people, so I will continue to come back as long as I am welcomed. I just hope that after my talk, I'm still welcome. So thank you all. I should also say that I'm a parent. I have a 16-year-old, that's my youngest, and I have a college student as well. So when it comes to these issues of drugs, of course, I not only care about these issues as a scientist, I care about these issues as a parent as well. So this is not some sort of just distant intellectual engage or discourse or conversation that we're going to have. This is personal as well as professional, okay? So you guys, you with me? All right. And I'm going to try to go as slow as possible so we all understand. Because the title of the talk is Dispelling Drug Myths in order to help those who are in need. That's the goal. And in order to do that, we have to acquire some knowledge, some basic knowledge. And sometimes acquiring knowledge is difficult because that means you have to get rid of some of the misinformation that you may have held. And that misinformation may have served you personally well, but the ultimate goal is to try to continue to get better. So I'm here in order to help you understand how the ignorance about drugs participate in the subjugation of others, particularly those people on the margins of our society. And I hope that I can present to you a different perspective, a perspective that will enhance human rights. And so let's start with drug myths. The first drug myth that I'd like to start with today is this notion that a public health approach is treatment in lieu of, that's treatment instead of incarceration. So oftentimes we hear people say, public health officials, people in the community say, no, we would rather have people go to treatment than to go to jail. Now, that sounds good. It sounds like you are progressive and you are forward thinking. But remember, when Dr. Benj presented information today, which was really good to see, he presented information basically saying this is what we know from around the globe. 75 to 90% of the people who use drugs like alcohol, shabu, opiates, all of those drugs, 75 to 90% of the people who use those drugs, they don't need drug treatment because they don't have a problem. Now, this isn't just me talking. This evidence has been collected. I list here some of the references. This evidence has been collected for decades. We have known this. We've known that most of the people who use shabu, for example, don't need treatment. I've written about this in my book, so if you want to see more of the details, you can see that most of the people who use drugs don't need treatment. In some cases, like where I'm from the United States. Our last 3 presidents, they all used illicit drugs when they were young men. They didn't go to treatment, but they went to the White House, right? Oh, I'm sorry. So when I was talking about drug treatment, people needing drug treatment and drug problems, I should explain what I mean when I say drug problems. when I say people don't have a drug problem, I just simply mean the DSM criteria for substance use disorder. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. It lists all of these disorders, including substance use disorder, commonly referred to as drug addiction. And you can see here these are 11 of the symptoms. In order for someone to meet criteria for a drug addiction, they have to endorse 2 or more of these symptoms. If they endorse 2 to 3, they're considered to have a mild substance use disorder. 4 to 5, they're considered to have a moderate substance use disorder. And above 6 or 6 and above, they're considered to have a severe substance use disorder. And you can just see some of the symptoms. Take more of the substance in larger amounts over longer periods than intended. They have this persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control their drug use. They spend a great deal of time in activities necessary to obtain, use the substance, or recover from the substance's effects. Recurrent use resulting in failure to meet major obligations at work, at school, at home. They continue to use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems that are caused or exacerbated by the effects of the substances. So you can see this. In some cases, tolerance is there, some cases withdrawal, some cases craving. But when I talk about having a problem, when I use the term drug addiction, drug abuse, or substance use disorder, I mean these symptoms. So we are all speaking the same language. Right. So, but the bottom line that I was trying to point out was that most of the people who use drugs don't have a problem. So therefore, drug use is not drug abuse. Oftentimes, the 2 terms are conflated for a variety of reasons, for political reasons, for other types of reasons. But when we think about somebody being a drug user, we can't automatically go to the next step that they are a drug abuser or that they are drug addicts. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, most of the people who use drugs don't have a problem. Now, I have an analogy that we can use. We can think about this with another sort of potential problem in society. Let's think about driving an automobile. We actually use a public health approach when it comes to automobiles. Automobiles are potentially dangerous. People can actually die from automobiles. There are accidents. In the United States, for example, every year there are more than 30,000 deaths that occur as a result of automobile accidents every year. Now, we can dramatically stop that. I mean, we can stop that 30,000 every year. We can stop it. We can simply ban cars. You all down with that? Banning cars. We will wipe out nearly all of the automobile accidents in the United States. We can simply do that. But we don't ban cars. We rarely even send people to jail as a result of violating a traffic law. We rarely do that stuff. Instead, what we do is that we have implemented some decriminalization strategies, a real public health approach. We actually increase education around driving automobiles. We make sure that you are the appropriate age and you have the appropriate training before you get behind the wheel of an automobile. Yeah? And we implement seatbelt laws because we know that most of the deaths that occur as a result of automobiles occur because people drive too fast and they don't wear seatbelts, and then followed by alcohol. So what we've done is we've implemented laws such that we require you to wear seatbelts, and we have speed limits. That's a decriminalization sort of approach, because if you violate those laws, you might receive an administrative fine, but you don't go to jail. And we keep our citizens safe in the best way we can, because we know that automobiles can also be useful. It's true that they are potentially deadly. That's true. But they're also useful. You guys follow me? With me? All right, that's simple enough. All right, great. So why don't we do the same thing for drugs? Are you all with me? So I didn't see you shaking your head as vigorously when I said, why don't we do the same thing for drugs? We can actually do the same thing for drugs. If we think about what we're really worried about. I'm sorry, I started to talk too fast. I didn't tell you like what I do in my science. So what I do in my science is that we bring people into the laboratory at Columbia University, and we give them drugs like shabu, cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and we test the effects of these drugs in people. And sometimes we're trying to test the effects so we can develop treatments to help people. And other times we want to know what is the impact of these drugs on cognitive performance, on sleep, on food intake, a wide range of questions. And that's how we know what these drugs do and don't do. And we publish this in the scientific literature. So we understand. So now let's go back to this question. So when we think about, if we're thinking about the drug user, this is the drug user themselves, we can implement some strategies like we did with driving that help keep people safe. We can have some things like age requirement. In fact, how old do you have to be to drink alcohol in this country? 18? Yeah, so you have age requirements for alcohol. You can do a similar sort of things with other drugs. Another concern about drugs that are bought illegally are not so much the drugs themselves, but the impurities, the things that the drugs are cut with, the adulterants. That's a concern because you don't really know what's in them, and people can hurt themselves with those impurities. You can simply implement free drug testing sites where people can go and test the drugs to make sure that the drugs are pure. You can do other sorts of things as well to make sure people are safe. If the goal, now this is only if the goal is to keep people safe. If that's not the goal, then I sound like an idiot up here. If your goal is not to keep people safe, then I'm sorry for wasting your time. But let's go back. I don't want to forget about those people who are addicted, because there are a small percentage of people who become addicted to drugs, and we have to be concerned with them. Now that we know that the vast majority of the people who use drugs are not addicted, then that tells us, any thinking people, it tells us that we cannot blame the drugs themselves, because the vast majority of people are not addicted to the drug. So we can't blame the drug. So then that raises the question, if it's not the drugs, then what is it? Well, now I need your help. I need you to indulge me for a second with some science. The thing that we've been learning in science as it relates to drugs is that you can disrupt, stop, decrease drug use simply by having available to drug users attractive alternatives. Now, what do I mean by attractive alternatives? Attractive alternatives, before I tell you what attractive alternatives are, I need to tell you about an animal experiment that's important. Back in the 1970s, a researcher by the name of Chris Ellen Johansson, her and her colleagues, put several non-human primates in a cage, set them up with intravenous catheters such that when they pressed a lever, they could receive injections of drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine. And they only gave these animals access to that lever to press for drug. So all day, the animal only had access to the lever. No food, just the lever. And you know what happened? The animals pressed the levers so much until they died. And this was taken as evidence that drugs are so dangerous and so addictive because those animals killed themselves by pressing the lever constantly. So what do you think of that? Well, you don't know what to think about it. Fast forward a couple years later, a researcher from Canada, Bruce Alexander, did a similar kind of experiment with rats. But he gave the rats a choice between the lever for morphine, and rats had also options to have treats, playmates, sexually receptive mates, and so forth. The animals that had the options, the attractive alternatives, did not take so much of the morphine, whereas the animals that did not have those options, they took almost all of the morphine. And these kind of experiments were done now in humans. Fast forward until the early 2000s, we did an experiment where we brought people into the lab who used Shabu. We gave them an option between Shabu, multiple doses of Shabu, and $20. So they had $20 was the attractive option versus Shabu. When you give people attractive options like that, what do you think? These people, by the way, were considered to be Shabu addicts. When you give Shabu addicts an option like that, what do you think happens? Well, I'll tell you. Here are the data. In the black, these are the numbers of folks who took the money. And this is how many times they took the drug. You can see that even people who are identified as Shabu addicts, they chose money when they have attractive options. I know some of you smart people may say, well, they just took your money because then they would go and buy Shabu later outside of the lab, right? Let's just say they did that. It still shows that they are rational and they can inhibit their behavior. They can exercise delayed gratification, all the things that we said they couldn't do. The point here is that drug users can and do behave rationally. Another point is that attractive alternatives are important, but they're not the only reason that people become addicted to drugs. People become addicted to drugs because of other reasons, such as co-occurring illnesses, whether it's physical pain, whether it's psychiatric illnesses. A large number of people who are addicted also have other co-occurring illnesses. And if you treat those other illnesses, you treat the drug addiction. That's another reason. Other reasons is that some people just have not developed the responsibility skills to inhibit their behaviors or in multiple domains. The point here is that the reasons why people become addicted are plentiful. Our jobs as public health officials or people who are trying to help folks is to first do a comprehensive assessment. It's the most important thing. And that comprehensive assessment cannot simply stop at looking at whatever drug they're taking, because the drug that they're taking is not that informative. You have to do a comprehensive assessment to figure out what is going on with that person. So let's deal with another myth. Another myth is that drug prevention is preventing all drug use. So there's this belief that we can prevent all drug use. That's impractical, not feasible. So when we think about drug prevention, the first question that we must ask is, what are you trying to prevent? Are you trying to prevent all use of drugs, including alcohol use? I just want to quickly talk about some data from the U.S. This is data that we collect in high school students, people who are about 16 or 17 years old. We've been doing this for more than 40 years. And one of the things that we know, when you ask kids at this age about their drug use, nearly half of them report having used marijuana at some point in their life. 2/3 of them report having used alcohol at some point in their life. 1/3 report having smoked tobacco. Now, these numbers can fluctuate over years. The point is that throughout the 40 years or so of collecting these data, kids at that age have always used drugs and will always use drugs. So the notion that we can prevent drug use or we're going to stop drug use in a society, it's just not practical. It's not reasonable. Humans have always used drugs since they inhabited the earth. Humans will always use drugs. And frankly, you don't want to live in a society in which people don't use drugs. Trust me. You have alcohol for receptions and those sorts of things, right? You guys go to receptions and there's alcohol. It would be boring without alcohol, right? So I would suggest when we think about preventing drug use, when we think about what we're trying to prevent, I would suggest that we focus on preventing drug abuse. Now, if you're focused on preventing drug abuse, that means that you have to actually provide some education. You have to provide education, and the education has to be objective. It has to be what we say is evidence-based. Unfortunately, the term evidence-based has begun to lose its meaning because oftentimes the people who talk about evidence-based don't know evidence if it kicked them in the face. Now, evidence, when I use the term evidence, it means that it comes from empirical generated studies. That means that it's controlled, it's not anecdotal, it's not something that your uncle told you or some person told you. It's empirical evidence. Now, that raises the question when we think about drug education, who's qualified to give drug education? Who's qualified to deliver this information? In the U.S., several years ago, we had this thing called DARE. It was Drug Abuse Resistant Education or something like that. And it was delivered by police officers. One of the stupidest ideas that have ever come out of the United States. Police officers are not qualified to do drug education. Nor should they be. Just like I'm not, well, I didn't tell you also, when I was in the military, I was a police officer. So I was going to say, just like I'm not qualified to do police work. Well, maybe when I was in the military, people thought I wasn't qualified to do it, and they might have been right. But the point is that I'm not qualified today to do police work because that's not what I do. I spent my life trying to understand the effects of drugs. And so people like me who actually have studied drugs, people who know something about drugs, are qualified to deliver drug education. Politicians are not qualified to deliver drug education or drug-related information. So we have to examine who is delivering drug education, drug-related education. And I'm going to give you just a quick example of how you can do this, how you can decrease harms or decrease drug abuse. This is just one quick example of appropriate drug education. The most important thing when it comes to taking drugs is dosed. The difference between a therapeutic and something that's pleasurable and a toxin is dose. At one dose, it might be pleasurable. At another dose, it could kill you. That is, people should be attentive to dose. Also, they should be aware of the user's history. Is that person tolerant? Has that person been taking the drug for some period of time? If so, you can increase the dose. Tolerance serves as a protector. They need to also be aware of the environment under which the drug use is occurring. If you're in an anxiety-provoking environment, you can increase the likelihood that people will have some negative effects. So you want the drug use to occur in a comfortable sort of setting. And people should know something about the route of administration. How is the drug being taken? Is the drug being smoked? For example, is marijuana being smoked? Or is it being eaten in an edible form? It matters, because if you smoke marijuana, the effects will be felt within 5 to 10 minutes, quickly, the peak effects. Whereas if you take it orally, you eat it, the peak effects will not be felt until an hour or 90 minutes later. So if you take it orally and then you don't feel the effects after 15 minutes, and you put more in your stomach and you still don't feel the effect after 30 minutes, and then you put more in your stomach, you're still not feeling the effect, well, here's what can happen. Let me show you what can happen. Can I get some sound?
To confiscating marijuana from suspects and then baking it in brownies. And once he and his wife were full and high, they thought they'd overdosed and called 911.
I think I'm having an overdose of this, so is my wife.
Overdose of what?
Marijuana. I don't know if it had something in it. Can you please send rescue?
Did you guys have fever or anything?
No, I think we're dying.
Okay, how much did you guys have?
I don't know. We made brownies, and I think we're dead. Time is going by really, 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 really slow.
So that's an example of people not having the proper amount of education. We laugh at this. This is kind of funny, of course. But this information is simple and basic that we can teach people to avoid these kind of situations. That's just one example of teaching people basics about pharmacology. Now I want to shift gears and talk specifically about Shabu, because I think this is a major concern here in the local community. Now, Shabu is an amphetamine. It's an amphetamine just like amphetamine. Now, I want you to know that Shabu, methamphetamine, and amphetamine are both approved in the United States for medical purposes. Now, of course, I'm not talking about the drug that people buy on the street, but they're the same chemical. The illicit methamphetamine is the same chemical as the one that we produce pharmaceutically in the labs. Both amphetamine and methamphetamine are legally available in the United States for prescription. So that means that people can be prescribed amphetamine for things like attention deficit disorder, narcolepsy, and our military currently uses it in some occupations like aviation, or people who have to work extended periods. By the way, amphetamine is also legal in this country by prescription. It's regulated, of course, but they use it in this country for attention deficit disorder. Now, methamphetamine, which is similar, and I'll show you this in a second, is also used medically in the United States. Not often, but it is available medically to treat attention deficit disorder and obesity. Now, when you look at these two chemical structures, on the left is amphetamine, on the right is methamphetamine. The only difference between these compounds is this red circle here. This red circle is an additional methyl group that is on the methamphetamine structure. Some people have said that that additional methyl group makes methamphetamine more dangerous, more toxic. We, along with others, have done studies where we have compared the two drugs in people. And what we and others have found is that these two drugs are they're pharmacologically nearly identical. They produce the same effects in humans. So the addition of that methyl group, if it produces any effects, they are imperceptible in humans. They are the same drug. Now oh, I'm sorry. Oh, what? You let me do this? Why didn't you? It just happened? I'm sorry, I was talking. I'm sorry. And where did I leave off? What did the tape say? Did you guys see the compound before? Yes? All right, right on. All right, okay. Whenever the picture goes out, that means I said something too much, so too controversial. No, the bottom line is that these drugs are the same. They produce the same effect. Now, do we understand that? This is critically important. Methamphetamine, amphetamine, same drug. They are used medically. In the United States, children, average age of children who are prescribed amphetamine, 7 years old. They take the drug on a daily basis. They're fine. So when we hear those statements about what Shabu does to people, think about that sort of thing. You guys, do we have any cognitive dissonance going on? I hope. Yes? Yes. Okay, right on. Okay, now I was saying about amphetamine and methamphetamine, they're the same drugs, but it's important for us to also know that when we are dealing with amphetamines, there are also some real concerns. So I don't want to downplay this as well, because one of the things that amphetamines do is that they're really good at disrupting sleep. In fact, that's why some people take them. You take them because of narcolepsy. People are falling asleep with narcolepsy. You want to keep them awake. Amphetamines keep you awake. And if you're taking too much at large doses without attending to your sleep, you can produce some real problems. Psychiatric problems can manifest that way. That can be a real issue. Sleep is one of the most important physiological functions to humans. So if people are constantly disrupting their sleep, then you might see some problems. Now, if you start to see that problem, what do? You make sure people get sleep, right? That's one thing. Another thing that amphetamines do really well is that they disrupt appetite. They decrease food intake. Food, of course, nourishes our bodies. We need minerals, vitamins in order to be healthy. So we have to make sure people are eating properly as well. And then, if you have cardiovascular issues, amphetamines are cardiovascular stressors. If you're not healthy, it could be problematic for your cardiovascular health. So those are real problems that we have to be concerned with when it comes to methamphetamine. We good? Okay, so let's go back to the myths. So when we think about myths specifically related to Shabu, this myth won't die. Shabu causes violence. Now, it's true that there are some violent people who happen to use Shabu. They were violent before they used Shabu, and then they might be violent after they use Shabu. Just like with alcohol. There are some violent people who use alcohol. But to say that Shabu causes violence, the evidence for that is just lacking. It's not there. And I know you can find people who are engaged in violence and they also use Shabu. But the vast majority of people who use the drug are not engaging in violence. I mean, we have pilots who are essentially taking the drug in the United States. Children. They're not violent. So we can't make that leap. It's illogical. Now, one of the more pernicious, sort of troubling myths about amphetamines, Shabu, is that it causes brain damage. I mean, I've read Facebook page sort of notices coming from the Philippines. They're quite imaginative. I think they say Shabu shrinks your brain. You guys familiar with this? You with me, or is that another country? Is that this country? You guys have heard this? Yeah. So it says shrinks your brain, causes all these problems. All right. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to take a step back and try and think about where this comes from. Because whenever you see these kind of myths, they usually have some origin. And I think the origin of this myth comes from animal data. Like, one of the sort of consistent finding in laboratory animals is that when you give laboratory animals large doses of methamphetamine, injecting naive animals, you inject them with super large doses that are 10, 20, 30 times what you give humans, you can nicely destroy monoamine containing neurons. These are neurons that contain dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. You can nicely destroy those neurons, cause damage to those cells. They're gone, they're damaged. You can show this in laboratory animals, and you can consistently show this with methamphetamine, with amphetamine. It's one of the more consistent findings that you can see. And that, you will see that over and over in the literature. But people kind of stop there. But if you just go one step further, now you start to really get the information. If you allow the animal to become tolerant before giving the large dose, so that means that you expose the animal to escalating doses over a couple days, and now you give this large dose, you don't see the toxic effects on those cells. So tolerance is protective. So there are a number of important points that I just made there. One, the doses that are used in animals, laboratory animals, to produce the toxicity are extraordinarily high and way beyond what humans would take. Two, even at those doses, you can have protected effects if you allow the animal to become tolerant. Are we good? Everybody got that? So, all right, now we're done with the animals. What about humans, right? I guess that's what you want to know. What about humans? What happens with humans? Well, this takes me to my third and final myth. Drug addiction is a brain disease. That's my third and final myth. Now, I will use the amphetamine data to talk about this particular myth. But before talking about this myth, I want to make sure we all are clear what I mean when I talk about drug addiction as a brain disease. It means that there are some neurobiological substrates, that is, structures, chemical, that differentiate those people who are addicted from those people who are not addicted. So you can look at the brains of people who are drug addicts versus those who are not, and you can tell the difference. That's what I mean when I say drug addiction is a brain disease. And here it is in graphic sort of form. One of the sort of favorite pictures of people who do neural imaging is that they put up a picture like this. And they tell you, the audience, focus your attention on the left. That's a picture of someone who's never used Shabu. Focus your attention on the right. That's the picture of someone who has used, that's someone who's a Shabu addict. This is a PET image. I will explain what PET image is as simply as I can. In order to get this image, we inject a radioactive chemical in your body that selectively binds to dopamine cells in your brain. We think that amphetamines will produce toxic effects on dopamine cells. That's why we're looking at dopamine cells in this case. So you inject this radioactive compound into your brain, it binds to the dopamine cells in a specific region of your brain, and then it emits a signal and it lights up, and you see this bright light. In this case, the simplistic sort of thinking would say, oh, these people have more of those dopamine cells, these are the non-drug users, than the drug users, where it's not as bright. Therefore, the drug users have destroyed their dopamine cells. That's the sort of simple interpretation. It would be wrong, but that's the simple sort of interpretation. You follow me? All right, great. So, now, this issue of is drug addiction a brain disease? I recently published a piece in Nature arguing that drug addiction is not a brain disease. And in this piece, it was a piece that was widely read, and some found it controversial, particularly those people who support the notion that drug addiction is a brain disease. But the important point is that most of the data that I talked about in this piece came from a paper that we published back in 2012, where we looked at the entire literature on methamphetamine and brain imaging. That is, people who use methamphetamine addicts, people who met criteria for methamphetamine use disorder, were being compared in multiple studies with people who didn't use the drug. So we looked at the entire literature, and we critically reviewed that literature to draw conclusions. What we concluded was that, yeah, you might find some differences in brain sort of structures or sizes of structures between methamphetamine users and controls in some studies. The most difference you may have seen in some structure may have been a 10 to 20% difference. Now, that 10 to 20% difference most likely remains within the normal range of human variability. What does that mean? That means that if we image this room, we would find that same difference, even if you did not use methamphetamine. It's just that all humans are not the same height, for example. All humans are not the same weight. All human brain structures are not the same. It doesn't mean that humans who have a smaller structure in this area versus that area is brain damaged. And so when we looked at the entire literature, including cognitive performance, we found that the methamphetamine users looked just like the controls. They were within the normal range. That was the best evidence supporting the notion that drug addiction is a brain disease. When you look at something like cocaine or heroin or those other sorts of things, it's nowhere near what the methamphetamine data, there's not even as much data. So methamphetamine was the best hope for finding evidence that drug addiction is a brain disease. Now, when I think about brain disease, I am thinking about things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. I'm thinking about those types of Huntington's disease, thinking about those types of diseases because once you have those diseases, unfortunately, at this stage in our history, you're more likely to die from those diseases because they are progressive, and you typically die from those diseases. Drug abuse is nowhere near that. So the notion that drug abuse is a brain disease is just simply not supported by the evidence. And I invite you all to read the literature, these papers. Now, I'm going to wrap up here shortly, but before I wrap up, I just have to say that I talked about empirical evidence, usually generated by science, of course. But I need you to know that my profession has participated in exaggerating the harmful effects of drugs. Now, we oftentimes talk about law enforcement's role, and people at this conference will talk about law enforcement's role, and that's kind of easy. We can see how law enforcement might exaggerate some of these things because it helps to increase budgets. The same is true in science. Scientific budgets are also increased as we intensify our war on drugs because the scientists are helping to solve this problem. Now let me just make it more clear for you. You should know that 90% or more of the world's research on these drugs are funded by the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse. And that's a great thing that the United States is making that contribution on the one hand. But you should also know that the mission of the National Institute on Drug Abuse is to bring the nation, is to lead the nation in bringing the power of science to bear on drug abuse and drug addiction. Their focus is on drug addiction, drug pathology. Please recall, I said that the majority of people who use these drugs don't have a problem, don't meet criteria for addiction. But the National Institute on Drug Abuse, their mission calls for them to focus almost exclusively on drug addiction. And that's just their mission. They do as they should. But you should understand that oftentimes we're starting from a pathological frame, from a biased frame. You should understand that. Now, what does that mean? Well, that coupled with the fact that we as scientists, we tend to err on the side of caution anyway, as if there are no consequences in erring on the side of caution, when in fact there are consequences, because you give a skewed perspective about what drug effects do, and you don't provide a comprehensive understanding of drug effects. It is like Upton Sinclair has once said, when he said it's difficult to get a man, and in this case a woman too, to understand something when his or her salary depends upon him not understanding it. You guys understand this? Yes. You with me? Thank you. Great. In reality, what happens is that we have created, or we help to create, an environment where certain drugs are deemed evil, and any use of those drugs are considered pathological. And then that leads us to this unrealistic focus on eliminating those drugs from our society at any cost to those people on the margins of our society. You guys got me? So when you put this all together, the question becomes, what does this mean for us in science? What does it mean for our comprehensive understanding of drug effects? It means that we most likely don't have a comprehensive understanding of drug effect. It decreases that likelihood. Our information is skewed towards pathology. It's biased. It decreases the likelihood of us discovering a broader range of drug effects. Like, for example, methamphetamine is used or can be used, or amphetamines certainly are used as adjunctive treatments for depression. But it decreases the likelihood of those drugs being investigated for a broader range of effects. It also impacts on what is published in the scientific literature. What's published in textbooks, in popular press. All of this information is skewed toward pathology, biased. Who reads this literature? All of us, treatment providers, educators, parents, politicians, you, me. We read this potentially biased literature. So, given that that's the situation, I will leave you with a take-home message. The quicker we dispense with our myths, the sooner we can implement strategies that will enhance public safety and health. That's one. And two, you should be on guard against those simple solutions, because they rarely work. When someone says, oh, I have a solution for the drug problem, and it's this. Almost never does that work. Humans are complicated, and it requires some thought. And please remember that science is not apolitical. It is very political. And now, I want to leave you with this final thought. When Doc Benj presented the data earlier, and I am grateful that he did, he pointed out that a number of people in your society are now being arrested for drugs, including politicians, including law enforcement officials. It reminded me from a conversation that I had in the car on the way here when we talked about this quote. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Thank you.